Hey there, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we bring you a chilling collection of horror stories set against the soothing sound of rain. Before we dive into suspense, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. If these stories send shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear slowly take over, and tell us if you enjoy this kind of storytelling. Now sit back and relax, we're about to begin. I woke up with the feeling that someone was watching me. The room was dark, but the glow from the street lamp outside spilled through the curtains, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. I held my breath, listening. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were slightly open had I left them like that. My pulse quickened. I had a clear memory of shutting them before going to bed. I sat up slowly, scanning the room. The shadows stretched and shifted as if they were alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light. But then I heard it, a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. A whisper. It was faint, almost like someone was standing just outside my window, speaking in a voice too low to understand. I swallowed hard. My apartment was on the third floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape. No one should be there. I threw off the blanket and stepped onto the cold floor, moving carefully toward the window. My own reflection stared back at me from the glass, wide eyes, breath shallow. I reached for the curtain, heart hammering. And then I saw it. A shape barely visible, standing in the alleyway below. A dark figure, motionless, head tilted upward, looking straight at me. My stomach clenched. The street lamp flickered, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw a face, blank, featureless, like a smudged painting. But then the light steadied, and the figure was gone. I stepped back, my breath coming in uneven gasps. Had I imagined it? The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Then came the knock. Soft, deliberate. 3 times. Not at the door. At the window. I froze. The knock was impossibly close, just inches away, separated from me by nothing but a thin sheet of glass. My fingers tightened around the curtain, as if that fragile piece of fabric could shield me from whatever was outside. My breath was loud, too loud. I forced myself to slow it down, to listen. Silent. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it had been the building settling, or a branch tapping against the window. But there were no trees outside. No balconies. No ledges. Another knock. This time softer. More deliberate. My mind raced, trying to grasp some logical explanation. A bird. A trick of the wind. But deep down I already knew the truth. I had seen the figure. And now it was here. I didn't want to look. I knew that if I pulled back the curtain, I would see something I wasn't ready to face. Something I wasn't meant to see. But I couldn't just stand there. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my skin prickling with the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. I took a breath and reached out. My fingers trembled as they touched the fabric. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it aside just an inch. The window was empty. I exhaled sharply, my shoulders sagging with relief. The alley below was just as it had always been, dimly lit, littered with scraps of paper that fluttered in the night breeze. No figure, no movement. Had I really imagined it? I leaned closer, pressing my palm against the glass. My reflection stared back at me, pale and drawn. I was about to turn away when I saw something that made my stomach lurch. My breath had fogged up the window slightly, leaving a faint layer of condensation. And there, in the middle of it, was a mark. A fingerprint, on the outside of the glass. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the nightstand. My heart slammed against my ribs. That wasn't possible. I hadn't touched the outside of my window. No one had. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the pounding of my own pulse. I backed up toward my bed, my body tensed, waiting, though I wasn't sure for what. And then, from somewhere deep inside the apartment, I heard another sound. Not a knock this time. A slow, deliberate creak. As if a door had just been opened. The creak came from the hallway. I stood frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The apartment was small, just a bedroom, a kitchen, a tiny living room, and a bathroom. I lived alone. No one should have been here. And yet something had moved. The air in the room had changed, thickening, pressing down on me. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to pull the blanket over my head like a child hiding from the monsters in the dark. But I wasn't a child, and I knew that whatever was out there wasn't imaginary. Slowly, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. My fingers fumbled over the smooth screen as I tried to unlock it, my hands slick with sweat. The moment I pressed the power button, the screen lit up, too bright, too sudden. I winced as the glow cut through the darkness. One missed notification. Unknown number, are you awake? I nearly dropped the phone. My fingers tightened around it as I stared at the message. My mind raced. It had been sent 2 minutes ago. I swallowed hard, my thumb hovering over the screen. My first instinct was to type back, "Who is this?" But I stopped myself. I didn't want to acknowledge it. Didn't want to invite anything closer. Instead, I turned on the flashlight. A thin beam of white light cut through the darkness. I moved it slowly toward the bedroom door, scanning the frame. It was closed just as I had left it. But the hallway beyond was not empty. The light caught something near the floor, just beneath the doorway, a shadow. It wasn't mine. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The shadow was still, stretching unnaturally long against the wooden floorboards. Someone was standing just outside my room. Watching. I took a step back. The floor let out a soft creak beneath my weight. The shadow didn't move. It didn't flinch. Whoever was out there was waiting. I felt a sharp, crawling sensation along the back of my neck, like unseen fingers brushing my skin. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and denial. This couldn't be real. I was still asleep, still dreaming. And then, the shadow moved. Not like a person shifting their weight. Not like someone adjusting their stance. It stretched, shifting in a way that shouldn't have been possible, elongating and twisting like something that wasn't bound by human bones. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stop a gasp from escaping. The door handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. I stepped back until my legs hit the edge of the bed. My entire body was trembling. The handle clicked, but the door didn't open. A whisper drifted through the gap beneath the door. Low, faint, almost amused. I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. And then my phone vibrated in my hand. A new message. Unknown number, you shouldn't have looked. My fingers tightened around the phone, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The words on the screen burned into my mind. You shouldn't have looked. I wanted to throw the phone across the room to pretend I hadn't seen the message. But I couldn't move. The door handle was still. The whisper had faded, but the weight of something unseen still pressed against the other side of the door. Waiting. I had two choices. Stay here trapped in my room like a cornered animal, or force myself to move, to do something before that door finally opened. I chose the second. With slow, careful steps, I backed toward my closet. My body was stiff, every muscle tense, as if expecting something to grab me at any second. The closet door was slightly ajar. I always left it like that. I didn't like the idea of it being fully closed. But now, as I reached for it, the darkness inside seemed deeper than it should have been. I forced myself to push that thought away. There was no time for hesitation. I slipped inside, pressing my back against the wall, barely breathing as I left the door open just a crack. Just enough to see. The apartment was silent. The seconds stretched endlessly. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then the door handle moved again. This time it turned all the way. A soft click, the sound of the latch releasing. The door opened an inch. Then two. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound. My phone was still in my hand, the screen dimming, but I didn't dare move to lock it. A shadow slipped through the doorway. It wasn't like before. This wasn't just the outline of a person. It was shifting, unnatural, like smoke curling and twisting against the floor. And then, as if pulled by invisible strings, it rose. A figure stood in my room. I could barely make out its shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. It had no distinct features, just a void where a face should be. But I felt its eyes. It was looking for me. The air in the room grew colder. My fingers were numb, my entire body rigid. I didn't blink, didn't breathe. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It drifted, its body stretching and contracting in unnatural ways. Its head turned slowly, scanning the room. I could hear something, a faint, distorted whisper, like a radio caught between frequencies. And then, my phone vibrated. The sound was deafening in the silence. I sucked in a sharp breath, panic surging through me. The figure snapped its head in my direction. I saw it move. It lunged. I threw myself backward, crashing through the closet door as the thing rushed toward me. I hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. My phone skidded across the wood, its screen flashing. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering against my ribs. The figure was already moving, its limbs distorting as it reached for me. I ran, out of the bedroom into the hallway. My bare feet slapped against the cold floor. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Something was behind me. I could feel it closing the distance, the air around me thickening as if it were pulling me backward. The front door. I lunged for it, fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking too badly to grip it properly. I forced myself to focus, twisting the bolt with all my strength. A whisper breathed against my ear. Too close. The door flew open and I stumbled into the hallway, nearly falling. I spun around. The apartment was empty. The doorframe gaped like an open mouth, the darkness inside pressing against the light from the hallway. But there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, just silence. And then from somewhere deep inside my apartment, my phone vibrated again. I didn't check it. I turned and ran. I ran. The cold hallway floor burned against my bare feet, but I didn't stop. I didn't think. I only moved. Apartment doors blurred past me, their numbers meaningless, their occupants oblivious to the nightmare unraveling just a few feet away. I reached the stairwell and nearly tripped as I threw myself down the steps. My breaths were ragged, my chest tightening with every frantic movement. Behind me, the air felt wrong. Heavy, like something unseen was watching. No, not watching. Following. I didn't turn around. The door to the ground floor was just ahead. I slammed into it with my full weight, my hands slipping against the metal handle before wrenching it open. The lobby was empty. Dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, flickering in that sickly, artificial glow that made everything feel just a little less real. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in gasps, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The front doors were just a few steps away. Beyond them, the city stretched into the night, quiet streets bathed in orange lamplight. I reached for the door, and then my phone vibrated. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. I stopped. For the first time since I had fled my apartment, I hesitated. My fingers twitched at my side. I didn't want to look. Every rational part of me screamed to keep going, to push through the doors and disappear into the night. But something deeper, something darker, forced me to move. I pulled the phone from my pocket. Unknown number running won't help. I sucked in a sharp breath, my vision swimming. My thumb trembled over the screen. Another vibration. Unknown number, we are already here. I looked up. The lobby was empty. The reflection in the glass doors showed only my own wide-eyed, terrified face. And then, the lights flickered, just for a second. But in that second, I saw them. Not just one. Many. They stood in the reflection, scattered throughout the lobby. Tall, thin figures, their bodies stretching toward the ceiling like shadows that had lost their source. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their featureless faces turned toward me. Watching. The lights stabilized. The figures were gone, but I knew they hadn't left. They were still there. I took a step back, my pulse a drumbeat in my ears. A voice, low, distorted, whispered from behind me, so close I could feel the breath against my skin. "You let us in." The phone slipped from my fingers. The screen cracked against the tile, the last message still glowing in the darkness. I ran through the doors, into the street, into the night, but I knew I would never be alone again. It began with a simple question, one that lingered in my mind long after it was spoken. What if the past isn't really gone? I had never considered that there could be a link between the old cases I investigated and the strange occurrences happening around me. My job as a detective was about following the facts, not indulging in the kind of superstitions that others might entertain. But the past had a way of haunting, and recently the line between fact and fiction began to blur in ways I wasn't prepared for. My name is Ethan Pierce. I've been a detective for over 15 years, and I've seen a lot, most of it gritty and unsparing. But there was something about the cold cases that always drew me in. The older the case, the deeper I dug. That was the trouble, I suppose. I dug too deep. I sat alone in my dimly lit office, sorting through files of a particularly old case. It was a closed file, archived and forgotten by the department, yet I couldn't bring myself to let it go. It was a murder that had never been solved, one that had haunted this city for decades. The victim was a young woman, a local artist with a promising future, until she was found in a rundown alley, her life taken before it even truly began. Her name was Lily Drayton. The file was yellowed with age, its pages brittle. I ran my fingers over the edges, as though the paper could somehow reveal the truth I was looking for. There was a slight staleness in the air, like the office itself was waiting for something to happen. I had worked through the night, the city outside my window dark and still. A creak from the hallway outside startled me. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked up, momentarily distracted. No one should be here at this hour. I stared at the door, then back at the file. My mind wandered for a moment, unsure if I had just imagined it. But the feeling, that odd sensation of being watched, lingered. My eyes shifted back to the case in front of me. The details were as sparse as they had been when I first read them years ago. A woman murdered in the dark. No witnesses. No obvious motive. Just a pile of unanswered questions. And then there it was, an odd detail that stood out amidst the jumble of information. A note scribbled in the margins of one of the early reports. The victim's last art show was held in the old studio on Harper Street. Harper Street. I had been by that street a few times, but it was mostly forgotten. The studio, like so many others in this city, had been abandoned. Still, something about it gnawed at me. Why had the officer who made the note felt it necessary to mention it? It could have been a coincidence, but something told me it was. It wasn't just the victim's show that had ended in tragedy. It was something more. My chair creaked as I leaned back, rubbing my temples. I'd seen enough cases in my career to know that you never ignored a detail that stood out. especially not one like this. I stood walking toward the file cabinet, the movement slow and deliberate. My thoughts began to race as I sifted through old reports. Something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way the last words of the victim had been left untold. Maybe it was the unanswered questions that refused to die, lurking just outside the realm of what I could prove. But it felt like something was waiting for me. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the corner of my vision. A movement too subtle to be a trick of the light. I froze, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one. Just the empty hallway behind the office. I swallowed hard. I had been working late alone. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me, exhaustion pulling at the edges of my perception. But that feeling of being watched, it hadn't gone away. It was there, hovering in the corners of the room. I stepped out into the hallway, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. The building was old, cracky, and empty at this hour. Still, the silence felt wrong, as though it had been stretched too thin. My footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, the only sound in the building. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I passed by the old storage room. The door was slightly ajar, but it had always been that way. It wasn't unusual, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. But something about it, the way it seemed to beckon, as if it were waiting for me, stopped me in my tracks. I stood there, staring at the gap in the door. My breath seemed to catch in my throat. The building felt colder now, as though a draft had swept through the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in that room, something I wasn't supposed to see. I reached out and pushed the door open. Inside it was dark. The only light came from the flickering bulb above, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The room was full of old furniture and forgotten boxes, nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Except for the piece of paper on the floor. I knelt down slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I picked it up. It was an old photograph. The edges were worn, the image faded with age, but the subject was clear. A young woman standing in front of a familiar studio. Lily Drayton, the woman I had been investigating for so long. But there was something else in the photo. A man standing beside her. His face was obscured, as though someone had deliberately scratched it out. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Why would someone hide his face? And why had this photo been tucked away in this room? I glanced around, the shadows now seeming to shift more ominously. The room felt smaller, darker, as though it were closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. My phone buzzed suddenly, jolting me from my trance. I looked down at the screen, my pulse racing. I know what you're looking for, Ethan. The words stared back at me. I didn't know who had sent it, but I knew one thing for certain. The past wasn't done with me. It had found a way to pull me back in. I turned to leave the room, but the door behind me slammed shut, and the lights flickered out completely. My mind screamed for answers, but my body froze, paralyzed by fear. Something was here. Something from the past. And I had no idea how to stop it. The darkness closed in on me. The buzzing of my phone had long since stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence. I couldn't move, could barely breathe. My heart thudded in my chest, drowning out every other sound. The flickering bulb above me cast erratic shadows, stretching and distorting across the walls. I knew I had to get out, but the room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were pressing in, urging me to stay. What had just happened? The door, which had slammed shut behind me, stood there, mocking me with its immovable presence. I walked toward it, every step measured and careful, as though any sudden movement would set something off. My fingers grazed the doorknob. It was cold, too cold, colder than it should have been in the stale air of the room. I pulled. The door didn't budge. I yanked again, harder, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door was sealed. There was no handle on the inside, only the smooth wood of the panel. I was trapped. Vogus Ethan. Lengo. The thought was the only thing that kept me from losing control. I stepped back, scanning the room, my mind racing. The dim light reflected off the dust in the air, creating a dreamlike atmosphere, but it was far from calming. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist in on themselves, creeping across the floor toward me. The faintest sound reached my ears, scraping, like nails dragging across stone. I turned toward the far corner of the room, where I thought I had heard the noise. Nothing. The room seemed to mock me, as though it knew exactly what I was failing. And then there it was again. The sound grew louder. A scraping noise. Then the unmistakable sound of a whisper. You shouldn't have come back. I froze. The voice was faint, almost lost in the noise of my own thoughts, but it was unmistakable. My stomach clenched. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but I could feel the words gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I spun, but there was no one. The room remained as it had been, empty, save for the dust, the forgotten furniture, and the photograph in my hand. My fingers clenched tighter around it. The image of Lily Drayton stared up at me, her face both familiar and unsettling, a ghost from the past. It wasn't the first time I had heard whispers. In this line of work, you hear rumors, stories, things that should be left buried. I had dismissed them before, convinced they were just the product of the stress and the dark corners of a tired mind. But now, standing here in this dark room, the whispers felt real. They felt like something was closing in on me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I was a detective. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I believed in facts, in evidence. But the chill in the air, the sensation that something unseen was lurking just out of sight, made it harder and harder to ignore the growing knot of fear in my stomach. I could still hear it, the scraping sound. It was closer now. Louder. I turned my head, scanning the room, looking for the source of the noise. That's when I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room where the light didn't reach. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a shape, moving, shifting as though it had a mind of its own. I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. The shape didn't move like anything natural. It shifted, flickered, as if it didn't belong in the world I knew. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, tall, with a long coat and a face obscured by darkness. But before I could react, it was gone, melted back into the shadows. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. What the hell was happening? I needed to escape. I needed to find a way out. With frantic hands, I fumbled for my phone. It was still on the floor, the screen cracked from when I had dropped it earlier. I swiped at it, desperate to find something to anchor me back to reality. The phone lit up with a message one I hadn't seen before. "I told you to leave, Ethan." My blood ran cold. The message was from the same unknown number as before. My breath hitched. Who was doing this? Why were they targeting me? I knew the past had a way of pulling you back in, but this was something different. Something far darker. I looked around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting something or someone to emerge. The scrape of nails against the floor continued, louder now, as though the source was right beside me. I didn't dare look. Instead, I turned my focus to the window. There was no other way out. I had to get to the window. I had to break through and get to safety. I rushed to it, pulling at the window pane with all my strength, but it was stuck, jammed shut. The air was thick, suffocating. I pressed harder, feeling my muscles strain, but it wouldn't budge. Then from behind me, I heard it. A slow, deliberate breath. It was right behind me. My heart slammed in my chest. I whirled around, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. But there was nothing. Nothing except the shadows that seemed to shift and pulse in the dim light. And then there it was again. That voice, soft like a breath against my ear, chilling in its proximity. "You're not going anywhere." The words sent a jolt through me. My instincts screamed at me to run, to break free, but my legs felt like lead. I could feel something pressing in on me, closing the gap between us, but I couldn't see it. And then I heard the scraping again. But this time it wasn't from the walls. It was from the floor, slowly, methodically, getting closer. I turned, my hands trembling, and saw the source of the sound. A figure emerging from the shadow in the corner, its face still obscured. Its movement was unnatural, jerking and twitching like something caught between worlds. It stepped closer. I backed away, heart racing, every muscle in my body frozen in terror. It reached out for me. I didn't have time to think. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I ran for the door again, pounding against it with every ounce of strength I had left. And this time the door opened. The cold air outside flooded the room, the light from the hallway spilling in. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, desperate to escape whatever was following me. I didn't stop until I reached the stairs, gasping for air, my hands slick with sweat. I had no idea what had just happened. Was it real? Was it all in my head? All I knew was that the past wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The air felt different outside the room. Cold, but not in the refreshing way that night air should be. It was oppressive, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stood there in the hallway, hands shaking, my mind spinning. The old house creaked around me, the floorboards groaning under the weight of its long-forgotten history. I had made it out, but something didn't feel right. The further I walked down the hallway, the more I felt like I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of my vision flickered, making me turn my head, but there was never anything there. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I needed to focus. I needed answers. I pulled my phone from my pocket again. The message still lingered in my mind. I told you to leave, Ethan, who was sending me these messages. And how did they know I was here? I had barely told anyone about the case I was investigating, let alone the fact that I had come to this abandoned house alone. My eyes scanned the hallway. The dim lights from the old sconces cast long shadows along the walls, distorting the shapes of the rooms behind closed doors. Every step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was growing thicker, more suffocating. I could hear my footsteps echoing hollow in the stillness. It was unsettling. I had been in enough abandoned places in my career to recognize the weight of the silence. But this was different. This place felt like it was holding onto something, like it was trying to trap me. I gripped my phone tighter, pressing my thumb against the screen. The message from the unknown number stared back at me. I had to know who was behind this, what was happening. I tried to call the number, but it rang only once before the line cut out. Nothing. My mind raced. Who was doing this to me? And why now? I had investigated countless cases in my career, but this felt different. This was personal. Suddenly the air shifted. The temperature dropped again, colder than before. A shiver ran down my spine. Something was wrong. I turned, hearing a faint rustling sound behind me. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, closer. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured. I froze. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for a long time. The footsteps continued, each one growing louder, closer. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they were getting closer, almost as if they were following me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow. No one else was here. There was no one else in the house. I took a step forward, then another. The footsteps mirrored mine. I tried to steady my breath to calm myself. But the panic was rising like a tidal wave. I knew this feeling. I had felt it before, but I hadn't been able to explain it. The feeling of being hunted. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was nothing. No one. Just the dark hallway stretching on endlessly. Just keep moving, I told myself. Just keep moving. But my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I reached for the nearest door handle and swung it open, hoping for an escape. The room inside was pitch black, a void that swallowed up any light that tried to enter. I hesitated. This wasn't the way out, but I needed to get off the main hall. I needed a place to think. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The room smelled musty, like old books and decay. The air was thick with dust. I could feel the weight of the silence in here too, but it was different. It was waiting, watching. There was something familiar about this room, but I couldn't place it. I moved cautiously, my feet dragging against the floor as I tried to adjust my eyes to the darkness. Slowly, a shape began to take form. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and old newspapers, forgotten relics of a past long buried. I moved further into the room, my breath catching in my throat. The floor creaked beneath my feet. I paused, straining to listen. The footsteps were gone now, replaced by something far more disturbing. A low, guttural sound. Like breathing. Slow and steady, but wrong. Not the kind of breathing a living person makes. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was still the same as before. Yet something felt different. Something was there, something that shouldn't be. Focus, Ethan, I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breath. Focus. But the whispers started again. Soft at first, like they were coming from the other side of the room, but growing louder. They were unintelligible at first, but then one word became clear. Why? I stumbled backward, tripping over something. I didn't know what it was, only that it was heavy and cold, like stone. I fell to the floor, heart pounding in my chest, gasping for breath. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was this happening? Why? The whisper was louder now, closer. I could feel it like fingers brushing against my skin. I scrambled to my feet, looking wildly around the room. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to get away. I ran to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the knob. It wouldn't turn. It was locked. No, I pounded on the door with my fists, desperate. The breathing behind me was growing louder, closer. I could hear something moving in the dark, a shuffle of footsteps on the floor. The whispers now more voices, all speaking at once. You shouldn't have come. I turned my back to the door, eyes wild. The room was alive with movement, shapes flickering in the dark. I could feel something reaching out, something cold, something alive in the darkness, just beyond my vision. But I couldn't see it. And then in the far corner, something moved. A shape, a figure. I didn't have time to think. I ran. I slammed my shoulder into the door, throwing my full weight against it, and this time it gave. The door swung open and I was thrown into the hallway, gasping for air. The house seemed to close in around me, the shadows reaching out, grasping, pulling at me. But I didn't stop. I ran, my mind racing with questions, with fear, with panic. What was happening to me? What was in this house? I needed to know. But I didn't know if I could survive finding out. I didn't stop running until my legs burned, until the sharp sting of cold air in my lungs threatened to choke me. The old house, what was left of it, disappeared behind me, fading into the dark, twisted memories I didn't want to carry any longer. But the sensation of being watched never left. I could feel it, someone or something in the shadows, lurking just out of sight, always waiting. Every corner I turned, every alley I crossed, the air felt colder, more oppressive. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking into a trap. I had made it to the street now, the city's neon lights casting a cold, artificial glow across the pavement. The world around me felt both too quiet and too loud, as though every sound was amplified and yet nothing made sense. My hands were trembling and I could still hear the whispers, the same strange voices I had heard in that room. Were they real? Or was I just losing my grip on reality? My phone buzzed again. I froze, fingers gripping the screen. The number was still unfamiliar, but I couldn't ignore it this time. I stared at the message for a moment, the words sinking into me like a heavy weight. You can't run forever, Ethan. You're part of this now. My pulse quickened. The voice was clearer this time. I could almost hear the smirk behind the words, as if whoever this was knew something I didn't. My mind raced. Part of this. What did that mean? I glanced around, suddenly aware of how alone I was on the dark street. The city's noise, cars, people, the hum of the street lights, was so far removed from the haunting silence I had left behind in that house. I needed to find answers. I needed to talk to someone. I called Mark. No answer. The thought of going back to my apartment crossed my mind, but I couldn't do it. Not after what I had just experienced. My apartment felt like a prison, a place where the past would catch up with me like the house had. I couldn't go back to that suffocating atmosphere. I walked aimlessly, trying to clear my mind. The words, "You're part of this now," echoed in my ears. I couldn't shake them. Couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker than I could comprehend was pulling me deeper into its web. I made my way to a nearby park. It was quiet there, away from the chaos of the city, but the stillness did nothing to calm my nerves. I sat down on a bench, trying to steady my breath. The cold air bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing. What did the photo mean? Why had it been left for me in that room? How had I become a part of this? The woman in the photo, the one from Lily Drayton's case, her life had ended long ago. Yet somehow she seemed to be woven into whatever was happening to me. The whispers, the shadows, the growing sense of unease, they were all connected to her to that night. But how? The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel eyes on me again. Someone was watching me. No longer a distant presence, no longer a faint whisper. This was something closer, more tangible. I stood quickly, my eyes scanning the park. The streetlights cast long shadows across the paths, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place. But there it was again. A figure standing just outside the park's entrance. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel the weight of their gaze. My heart slammed in my chest as I took a cautious step toward them. They didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I took another step, then another. Still they didn't move. I felt like I was walking toward the edge of something. A precipice, a cliff, a breaking point. The figure remained still, an unblinking silhouette in the shadows. I didn't know whether to approach or run. Something told me that if I didn't move forward, the figure would stay there forever. But something else in me screamed to turn around, to run before it was too late. I took another step. And the figure shifted. It wasn't a sudden movement. It wasn't aggressive. It was slow, deliberate, as if the figure was waiting for me to make a move first. But the change was enough to freeze me in my tracks. It felt like they had just noticed me. Like I had finally crossed into their territory. The figure's head turned. Their eyes, dark, unreadable, locked onto mine. And then the whisper again. You don't know what you're dealing with, Ethan. My blood ran cold. The voice was different now, deeper, more menacing. This wasn't just a passerby. This was someone or something who knew more than I did. Someone who was leading me down a path I couldn't escape. I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. It was as if I was caught in their gaze, held in place by some unseen force. Then the figure spoke again, their words slow and deliberate. It's too late to turn back. I had no more time to think. I turned and bolted, my legs pumping, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, quick, purposeful, chasing me through the dark streets. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I was being pursued, but I didn't know by whom or why. All I knew was that I had to get away. I had to find some way to escape the pull of the past, to escape whatever dark force was controlling everything. I didn't know how long I ran. The streets blurred together, the world spinning around me. Every corner I turned, every alley I cut through, the footsteps were still there, never faltering, never losing pace. But then, as if by some twisted mercy, I reached a familiar street. My apartment building was just ahead. The comfort of familiarity. It was my only refuge. I burst through the front door of the building and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time until I reached my floor. I slammed the door behind me, locking it in place, and collapsed against it, gasping for air. I was safe, for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me was still out there, waiting. And I had no idea what would happen next. I stood there leaning against the door, my breath heavy, chest rising and falling in rapid succession. I could still hear the pounding of footsteps echoing in my head, as though they were following me, even though I had stopped running. The apartment felt suffocating now, too small, too quiet, as if the walls were closing in around me. I slowly sank to the floor, my back pressed against the door, unable to tear my eyes away from the narrow hallway that led to the rest of the building. The world outside seemed too far away, too distant. All I could think of was that figure, the shadow standing in the park, waiting, watching me. The whispers, the feeling that something was hunting me, closing in slowly, tightening around my throat. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain how someone had known exactly where I was, how they had been able to follow me with such precision. The message on my phone, the whispers in my ear, the photographs, they were all leading to the same conclusion. I was being watched. And I had no idea why. The room felt colder now, the chill seeping deep into my bones. I looked over at the window where the streetlights cast faint glows, flickering against the glass. It was late. Too late for anyone to be out there, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I pushed myself to my feet, needing to do something, anything, to regain control. My phone was still clutched tightly in my hand, the screen now cracked but still working. The message from the unknown number was still there, taunting me with its cold finality. It's too late to turn back. The words felt like a curse, heavy and unforgiving. I knew this wasn't just some random act. This was something personal. And I had no idea how deep it went, how far it reached. I had to find answers. I had to confront this, face whatever was waiting for me. But how? I paced the floor, running through the possibilities in my mind. I had no leads, no real evidence, just the creeping sense that everything I had uncovered was linked. Lily Drayton's case, the abandoned house, the strange messages, and the figure that had followed me. There was a pattern, I just couldn't piece it all together. I needed help, but who could I trust? Mark hadn't answered his phone. The police. They'd laugh me out of the station with my wild theories. No, this was something beyond their reach. I grabbed my jacket, throwing it on, and rushed to the door. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in the apartment, not with the walls closing in around me. I needed to talk to someone who knew more about this, someone who had answers. I thought of an old contact, someone from my past. A private investigator who specialized in old cases, the kind that no one else wanted to touch. Someone who had seen the darker side of this city, who might understand the connections I couldn't see. I stepped out into the night, the streets colder than before. I had no idea if I was being followed. No idea if whoever was watching me had been waiting for this moment, for me to make a move. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The city felt unnervingly quiet, too quiet for a place that should have been alive with noise and movement. I glanced over my shoulder every few steps, expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows, but the streets remained empty. I reached the old investigator's office after what felt like hours of walking, though it had only been a few minutes. The lights were dim, casting long shadows on the sidewalk outside. It was a small, nondescript building, tucked away in a corner of the city that most people ignored. The kind of place that seemed forgotten, untouched by time. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, my heart pounding. I knew the investigator had to be here. The office was always open late, always running on its own schedule. I didn't want to wait. I didn't have the luxury of waiting. Finally, the door creaked open. A pair of eyes appeared through the crack, narrowed and suspicious. "What do you want?" the voice asked, rough with sleep. "I need help," I said, barely able to keep the urgency out of my voice. "I need answers." The eyes studied me for a long moment, then the door opened wider, and I stepped inside. The room smelled like stale smoke and old paper. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, each one packed with case files. I recognized the name on one of the labels, an old missing persons case from years ago. It was one of the cases I had heard rumors about when I first started my career, but I never thought much of it. The investigator motioned for me to sit. I did, glancing around the office, feeling the weight of something heavy in the air. It wasn't just the clutter or the smell. It was the atmosphere, the sense that this room had witnessed countless secrets, dark secrets that had been buried for far too long. "What kind of answers are you looking for?" the investigator asked, his voice gruff but steady. I hesitated for a moment. "I'm being followed. Watched. And I think it's connected to an old case, one that hasn't been solved. Lily Drayton. She was murdered years ago, and now it feels like someone's reopening that case, reopening something I don't understand." The investigator leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "Lily Drayton," he repeated, as if the name was familiar. "I remember that case. Not many do. The way it ended, it was..." Right, right, I asked, my voice rising. What do you mean? Why does it feel like it's happening again? The investigator's eyes flickered with something I couldn't place. You should have stayed away, kid. Some things are better left buried. But now that you're in, I guess there's no going back. The words hit me like a physical blow. I didn't know if I was ready for whatever came next, but there was no turning back now. I'll help you, the investigator said, his tone softening. But you need to be prepared. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. I nodded, though the uncertainty in my gut only grew. Something was coming. Something old. Something dangerous. And I had no idea how much longer I could outrun it. Thank you for listening till the end. I hope you were able to relax and will now get a good rest. And don't worry, new stories are already on the way for tomorrow. So don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to stay connected. Now have a good night. See you in the next episode.